Today we're going to be talking about how culture impacts negotiation. And we're going to be using the work done by Jean Brett over at the Dispute Resolution and Resource Center. First, we have to understand what culture is. Culture is essentially a shared set of beliefs, values, norms, and expectations amongst a group of people, usually within the same geographic area. This is also tend to be shaped by things like social and economic and political factors, and culture itself shapes these things, as well as legal and religious institutions. So some of the things that we think about when we think of culture are the actual behaviors of people. For example, when you bow, how low you bow and how you bow is an indication of respect towards others when you're in the country of Japan. In India, when you greet people, oftentimes if you're Hindu, you say namaste. And when you're in South America, people tend to grab each other's upper arms. There's a lot of very close personal space versus having larger levels of personal space in other places such as Central Europe. In France and Italy, people kiss each other's cheeks, one on each side. I have some French friends who do that every time we greet. And then in India, interestingly, there is this thing called a head nod, where it looks like people are saying no, but in fact what they're doing is they're saying, I hear you. So if somebody's going like this when they're talking to you or when you're talking, it means that they're saying, I hear you. If you've ever seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire, which by the way is a brilliant movie, and I highly recommend it, the individuals are always kind of doing this. And at first it just looks like a little shake, but then you realize that what they're saying is, I hear you, I hear what you're saying. So all of that can be very helpful, but in the end, it doesn't help us an awful lot when it comes to connecting with people across a negotiating table. So how are cultural beliefs, values, norms, and knowledge structures similar and different? Well, first of all, values are end states. They're kind of where you want to be compared to where you wish you were. So a good example of that might be, wanting to be a better person than you are a bad person, or good person instead of a bad person. Inside of research, we might look at it from the point of view of very individualistic kinds of cultures that focus on the person, and the person focuses on themselves and their immediate family, versus more collectivistic cultures, which tend to be more focused on things like the extended family or whatever group they are a part of as the primary thing that they think about, how they affect the group versus how they're affecting themselves. Beliefs are expectations. Do you believe, for example, that the government should be solving problems, or do you believe that individuals should solve their own problems? In Sweden, it's truly believed that government should solve the problems that go on in society, and because they elect people to government to do that. On the other hand, in the United States, we truly do believe that the government should set up the ability of individuals to solve their own problems, and at the very best, or very worst, depending on how you look at it, there should be a public-private kind of partnership that goes on with government and individuals. That government shouldn't be there telling you what to do. Norms are agreed upon ways of acting. Now, these ways of acting can vary very, very dramatically from one culture to the next. For example, we often stand up when a woman enters into a room. If you're a guy, you stand up out of respect. You're supposed to do the same thing when heads of industry and people of higher status than yourselves tend to walk into a room when you are doing negotiations with individuals from, for example, Asia and the Middle East. Last, we have these knowledge structures. These are unconscious ways that we know that we're supposed to act. I have a friend of mine who is South Korean. South Koreans believe that whenever you come over their house, you have to feed them. You have to feed your guests. And when I was 20 years old, I went over to her mom's apartment. I was just dropping her off, and I had never met her mother before, though she was a good friend of mine. And so when I dropped her off to her mother's apartment, she said, you really should come up. Why don't you come up? Let's walk me to the door. So I walked her to the door. We got inside, and she said, look, now we're going to take you out to eat. And I said, no, I got to be somewhere. I really don't want to do that. That's fine. You don't have to do this for me. And I left after some hemming and hawing, because in the United States, you're supposed to thank people for their generosity, but not take advantage of them. There's a piece of that, at least from the northeast of the United States, which is where I'm from. So as a result, I insulted her mother. And her mother understood because she'd lived in the United States for 20, 25 years, but she was nevertheless insulted. So I'll never make that mistake again, to say the least. All of this is really about psychology, And it leads to this concept of possibly that several cultures have commonalities across certain ways of thinking and viewing them, thinking about them and viewing them. And those commonalities can result in what we call cultural prototypes, which can lump groups of cultures together in some generalized kinds of ways. So what we're going to do is go over some of the cultural prototypes that might help you in understanding whomever you're sitting across the table from when doing a negotiation. However, I have to emphasize that prototypes help to avoid prototypes and cultural value systems such as Hofstede's cultural value system and the Globe Project. All of these things are essentially stereotypes of individuals. They essentially say, on average, how do people tend to act? But the truth of the matter is that every individual within a culture, a specific culture, is vastly different from the next one. So the best thing you can do is use these as start points to begin to understand the people you're dealing with. But get to know them as individuals, no matter what you do. All right, so prototypes describe the way many, but not all, people act within a culture. So they tend to vary based on 6 different factors. How people view or get their self-worth, how power and status is construed to individuals within the culture, their sensitivity to responses sensitivity and responses to insults, confrontation styles, trust, how trust is established, and something we call mindset, which is how you look at the world and how you approach problem solving. Let's go through each of these for the 3 cultural prototypes we're going to talk about in this class. First cultural prototype is our own culture here in North America, known as a dignity culture prototype. Dignity cultures tend to center in North America, that's the United States, mostly United States and Canada, not so much in Mexico, as well as in Western Europe, really anything west of Germany and north and south of Germany. The key characteristic is the emphasis on the individual. So very individualistic. These cultures tend to be very individualistic. Self-worth is determined according to an intrinsic kind of thinking. I take care of myself. I feel good about myself based upon my own personal accomplishments, based upon the things that I can do. And therefore, my social status is based upon how I feel about myself. Because of these things, self-worth tends to be difficult to harm in dignity cultures. It's difficult to insult people unless you go after who they are or who they think of themselves as who they are. But if you insult their country, if you insult their group, it's not such a big deal to them. They tend to laugh that off. And oftentimes the way they look at it is, I don't have a problem. You insult me, but you know what? That's your problem. You don't like me? Too bad. That's on you. So dignity cultures tend to be pretty robust in taking insults as a result of this. And there's no presumption of any kind of social hierarchy. Whereas in many cultures, there's a status system put into place based on where you were born, to what village you were born to, what family you're born to, these kinds of things, how old you are. In dignity cultures, you tend to have this belief that it's much more egalitarian. We tend to believe that other people are just like us, they're just people, and while we might give you respect because you have more status than us, and status can be construed in many different ways, in the end, if you don't respect me back in some way, or somehow classy in how you deal with the differences in status, then I'm going to start feeling that maybe you don't deserve my respect. And that comes out very, very loudly in dignity cultures. So self-worth is very resilient, as I was saying, and perceived conflicts and violations of personal rights and autonomy tend to be the ones that get people annoyed. In other words, if I feel like you've taken away my inalienable right to pursue something, like I have a right for free speech and I have the right to confront my accusers and in the United States, innocent until proven guilty, those kinds of things. If my rights are violated or if I watch somebody else being treated unfairly or unjustly, that's when I get upset because that has to do with the individual. Trust in dignity cultures tends to be formed very quickly and based on faith. It's really funny, if you talk to other people, other travelers, and they talk about how they've met Americans who are say, backpacking through Europe, or they're traveling, what they say is about Americans is that Americans are really terrific. They're super friendly people, and they really want to get to know you, and they act like they're your best friends, and then they never contact you again after that. So they laugh it off, and they say Americans are extremely friendly, but their relationships are puddle deep. That's the perception that we get from a lot of other cultures, because trust in the United States is really, and in Western cultures and in dignity cultures, is based upon what we call reciprocity. This is the idea that if I do something small to show you that I'm willing to put myself in your trust, trust you with something, then usually you will return that, oftentimes by trusting me just a little bit more than the way that I trusted you. So this back and forth kind of reciprocity, this tit for tat kind of reciprocity means a return of the favor, is in every culture, but it's very strong in dignity cultures when it comes to building trust. And we start out on faith when it comes to building trust. We start out with the idea that I will trust you in general until I have a reason to distrust you. Lastly, we tend to have a very analytical mindset. We're not very sophisticated about how we view the world. We view the world as kind of a if A, then B kind of thing. I take that back. It's not that we're not sophisticated about viewing the world. We're not sophisticated about how we problem solve. We try to look for straight lines between cause and effect, as opposed to taking a look at history of things and how they came about in order to get to where we are today. Other cultures have a different kind of mindset, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Face cultures tend to be within Asia. That's where they're primarily at. Their key characteristic is this emphasis on the group instead of the individual. This doesn't mean you are giving up your individuality. It just means that you focus on the group that you're a part of and their needs over your own individual needs for the most part. So when you think about what your requirements are for a group, your responsibilities to whatever group you're a part of, that tends to take precedence over your personal wants, needs, and desires. And you might gripe about that. You might not be happy about that, but you understand your obligation back to the group. It's very interesting to me to every now and again, as you guys know, I do these group projects and I have this peer evaluation system where 20% of your grade is based on how well you worked with your group mates. And every now and again I get an email from somebody that says, this is not a nice idea, the peer evaluations really mess people up, I think it actually blows people apart and makes them not want to work together because it puts a price on how people want to work together, and you should just allow people to work together and they will do well for the group. And my first question to the student who sends me that email is, I wish that were the case. Please tell me something. Where are you from? And invariably they tell me they're from somewhere in Asia. It's really fascinating. So this collectivistic idea that the group should be something you should be worried about, and the group's needs should be something you should be worried about, is not based in dignity cultures. In dignity cultures, we will gladly sacrifice the group needs for our own if we feel that that is a more expedient way to act, is a more efficient way for us to act. Whereas in more collectivistic cultures, that's considered a big no-no and a huge breach of cultural norms. Self-worth in the face cultures comes from these very stable, socially conferred hierarchies. So these hierarchies, again, are based on what family you're born into, where you're born, if you're born in a village versus born in a city, if you're born in the north versus born in the south, how the culture views what you are a part of. It can also be somewhat earned. For example, if you begin to rise up in the ranks of a corporation, you garner more and more respect because of the fact that you are a greater and greater level of a leadership position. And that never really goes away. Even if you end up leaving that organization or even fired from that organization, the fact that you rose to that level creates a certain hierarchy where you are in status above those who have never risen to that level. So self-worth is determined by what groups you are a part of. Sometimes this is very simple. Sometimes it's all family. For example, in Mexico, the collectivistic nature of Mexican society is entirely based on family, and not entirely, but mostly based on family, and much less based on what organizations you are a part of and things like that. This is why you see a lot of nepotistic hiring that goes on in Mexico. It's actually believed, even though it's against the law, that if you're in a place to actually hire people from the family into positions, that you better do it to help the family. Otherwise, it's a huge, again, breach of cultural norms. And again, this is very different than dignity cultures, such as in the United States, where the individual is the focus as opposed to the group. Other cultures, such as Japan, you have a layering of different groups that you're a part of and their importance. We'll talk more in the next video.